welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosatras, and this week I wanted to do a little more of a low-key video. I just wanted to do a quick run-through of my favorite literary authors. These aren't going to be like full-on book recs, just sort of author recommendations based on sort of what I've encountered so far. I probably will add more authors to this list as I go. We'll just jump through this. It'll be really fast and messy, and I'm not working from a script today, so we'll just wing it and it'll be fun. So it's good. So first off is Margaret Atwood. Margaret Atwood's kind of an interesting one because I don't feel like she has adapted to the modern climate as well as maybe some other authors. Her stuff, I think, is still interesting and still really important. She was a really important feminist voice in like the 80s and 90s. And I do genuinely enjoy her books. Alias Grace is my favorite book of hers. And I feel like she is not as open to change and growth as maybe some other contemporary authors in terms of like questions of gender and like sexuality and the spectrum of that kind of experience. Also, I don't think her books have a tendency to be terribly diverse. They do tend to focus on kind of the white woman at the center, and that's kind of it. Now, there are always exceptions to the rule and whatnot, but I feel like for the most part, I do enjoy her work, but I think she could maybe grow and evolve and change and maybe embrace the modern world a little bit more, just because we don't want her to become sort of too stuck in the past and not willing to kind of evolve, you know, in terms of depictions of gender and gender identity and diverse voices and stuff like that. So I do really enjoy Margaret Atwood's work. I have a ton of her books, and I think they're really good to read, but I kind of wish that she could like evolve a bit more and just move into the future a little bit more. So that's that. Next up, we're jumping way in the past here. We've got Jane Austen. Sense and Sensibility is my favorite of her books. I love Jane Austen so much, and she doesn't even really need much of an introduction. Everybody loves her. She understood kind of the things that keep people up at night, the things that obsess people, and that's things like relationships that ended badly, or the future, or growing, you know, not finding a relationship, or maybe even worrying about the future and worrying about making ends meet and finding, you know, support. Jane Austen's books all read very much like they're existing in kind of a dystopian world, which they sort of are, where women's value is specifically tied to who they marry. Even if they have a great deal of wealth, they have to marry for that wealth to kind of be passed on. And so you've got like Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. I really like that character. Everyone kind of makes fun of her, but literally she's kind of watching the clock ticking down, and if she doesn't marry off her daughters to wealthy men, even if her daughters don't necessarily like those men, if she doesn't marry them off, then they're all going to run out of money, or at least most of their money. And so I think it's just the dynamics in this one are great. Her sense of humor is wonderful, and I just adore it. I want to read more of her stuff. I've read 3 of her books so far, and I really, really want to read the rest. I do have all of them that I've collected over the years, and I need to finish reading her catalog, so to speak. Next up, we have Charles Dickens. This is David Copperfield. It's my favorite of his books. Dickens is another one that you kind of have to read with discernment, because while he did speak up for kind of the poor and downtrodden, he was, I wouldn't say explicitly white supremacist, but he was very complicit in kind of the white supremacy of the day. He didn't really feel like any other cultures or people from other cultures that weren't white had a lot to contribute to the world. And so his depictions of people who aren't white are few and far between, but when they do happen, they are very stereotypical and just not great. And the way the characters talk about other cultures, it's a little old-fashioned, and it can be very hateful. So I think when you read his stuff, his depictions of character is really good. He's got quirky characters coming out of the woodwork, and his plots are always really great. They tend to be either really long or really short. Like A Tale of Two Cities is like teeny, and you know, David Copperfield's huge. But I still think he's worth reading, but you do have to read his stuff with discernment and just be aware of his prejudices and his failings. Just so, you know, you don't kind of assume that that's the way things actually were. The next author on the list is kind of a cheat because I've only read one of their works, but that is Middlemarch by George Eliot. I really want to read her other works because this book is just an absolute masterpiece. It's so engaging, the different like plot points, how they weave together, her observations about society. There's some critiques of kind of the way that things work, and I really love how she's able to kind of blend genres, and just everything about this book is just wonderful. And so I really, really want to read more of her work. I know she's written at least 2 other novels, maybe? That's terrible. I need to look that up. But George Eliot, amazing. I'm definitely going to be reading more of her work because it is so good. Next one, I blame college for this one, and that's William Faulkner. The Sound and the Fury is my favorite Faulkner novel. The thing with Faulkner is that he's very confident in himself in terms of what kind of writer he thinks he is. His book Light in August, which is really good, he wrote it specifically to be a classic. Like, this guy is like hubris out the wazoo. He was like, I'm gonna write a modern classic and it's gonna be incredible. He didn't have that accent because he was Southern, but his work is genuinely interesting, and I like what he does with form and the way he messes around with perspective. And I don't know, he's a really captivating writer. His short stories are also really interesting. You've probably read his short story, A Rose for Emily. Oh, it's Circe. Hi, baby. Hi, baby. Yeah. And A Rose for Emily, which is sort of like a gothic horror. It kind of has the creepiest ending ever. But yeah, Faulkner is great. Don't like just dive into his stuff expecting it to be super, like, I'm not going to say accessible, because it is kind of accessible ultimately, but you do have to kind of live in his brain for a bit before you get sort of comfortable with how he writes, because he can be kind of weird sometimes. Light in August is probably a good starting point. It's a lot more accessible. Also, As I Lay Dying is great. This one is very bizarre, but it's cool. So I don't know, we'll do that. Next up is Victor Hugo. Now, Les Mis is my favorite of his works. I also really love Hunchback of Notre Dame. Another thing you have to be aware going into his work, he was a champion for the lower classes, and he was very provocative for his time, and I think his stuff is very universal and has a lot to say. However, there is some systemic racism baked into his stuff. For example, especially in Hunchback of Notre Dame, the depiction of the Roma people is really terrible. There's a lot of stereotypes, and he uses it kind of for shock value. And if your experience with that is the Disney movie, okay, stop knocking things over, baby. If your experience with that is the Disney movie, where it's sort of like the Roma people standing up for their rights amid oppression, that's not really what the book is about. The book just kind of uses them as like an exotic backdrop. So I think this book is definitely worth reading, and I think Hunchback can be worth reading, but just be aware, this was written in the 1800s, and also he loves hyperfixating on tangents. This book is especially bad for it. The tangents do ultimately make sense, like some of them more obviously than others. I know, yeah, some of them more obvious than others, but it's just one of those things where you kind of have to just go with the flow and be like, this will eventually make sense. So like, it's a thing. But I do genuinely like Victor Hugo, and he's very melodramatic and over the top, and that just is kind of my jam. Baby. Yes. Next up is Zora Neale Hurston. This book, Their Eyes Are Watching God, is my favorite of hers. She's written a couple others. She also has a book of essays that was recently published, like a collection of essays by her that I really, really want to read, because it looks really, really good. Hurston is such a talented writer. She was also very much an anthropologist and a folklorist, and so her work very much blends kind of the crisp storytelling of folklore with like genuinely compelling human drama set in kind of her contemporary world, which was the America, like South and New York in the 1920s. I love her work. I love her writing style. Her collection of short stories, hitting straight like with a crooked stick. Some of those stories are just hilarious. Some of them are tragic. She has such a good writer's voice, and she's so entertaining. And I really like her. All right, I have two cats here now. My next author on this list is Toni Morrison. She is outstanding. I've read 3 of her books so far. This one, Sula and the Bluest Eye. They're all incredible. They all approach really complex, raw issues from different kind of directions. She's a very honest writer. She's very unflinching. She calls things out without oversimplifying things, which I like. A lot of novelists have a tendency to sometimes take a complex issue and simplify it so they can use it for kind of shock value to appeal to the emotions of the readers. And she doesn't ever do that. There's lots of complexity and depth and nuance. She explores generational trauma, systemic racism, the effects of growing up in a world where all the rules are stacked against you, and she looks at complex family relationships. She really digs into abuse, all kinds of stuff. Her books aren't warm and sunny and feel good, but they're very important, and they're so good. And she has such a gorgeous prose style. The Bluest Eye is her first book, and that one's a little bit more raw and jagged, but like Beloved has just a flowing, beautiful prose style that stands in really sharp contrast to kind of the horrors that it's exploring in terms of the effects of slavery and the legacy of all that. But Toni Morrison is wonderful. I absolutely love her work. This book, and I think a couple of others, she recorded unabridged audiobook versions of some of her books, maybe all of them, and she recorded them herself. And I listened to the audiobook of Beloved, and it's so awesome to hear kind of her own prose in her own voice. She gives the characters such a beautiful kind of vibrant quality that just brings them to life even more so than if you're reading them on the page. So would recommend. I love Toni Morrison, and you should too. Next up, I've talked about this author a lot on this channel, so I'm going to zoom through this one, but that's Amy Tan, The Joy Luck Club. I just think the way she describes families and the complex relationships we have with families is so good. She has been criticized for kind of resorting to stereotypes and Orientalism at times. And so be aware of that when she's, when there's descriptions of kind of Chinese culture, and if you encounter something that feels like a stereotype, just be aware of that. I think the value in her work comes from her beautiful prose style and her descriptions of the thought processes of just normal people in complicated relationships with family members. That's kind of the big takeaway, and I really would recommend her work to anyone. This is my favorite of hers. I've read 2 of her other books, and I want to read the rest of them just to kind of get an idea of kind of her whole vibe, just because I really appreciate living in her world. She's just a really wonderful writer. finally on this list is also someone I've talked about before, and that's Virginia Woolf. Mrs. Dalloway is my favorite of her books. I've also read A Room of One's Own and The Waves. She's got a couple other books. I really want to read Orlando. That's on my TBR. That's kind of a complex, almost magical realism kind of book that explores gender in cool ways. So I really want to read that. But Virginia Woolf, writing in the early 20th century, she's a modernist writer. So lots of stream of consciousness, lots of exploring with like queer themes in a time when you really couldn't do that. So a lot of it is sort of couched in metaphor or hidden, but it's really, really interesting to kind of get into her brain and just see how she portrays kind of the complex relationships between people, the things that people hide, the things that people talk about, the faces that people present to the world versus what's going on inside their mind. I think her work is just really captivating, and her nonfiction is also really wonderful. A Room of One's Own is wonderful. That's where we get that that whole kind of thought experiment about Shakespeare's sister. If he had a sister who was just as talented as he was, what would have happened to her? And I think that's a really kind of important depiction of sort of, you know, systemic sexism and things that we still face today. I know things are different now than they were in the 20s, but we're not advancing nearly as fast as I think we could be. So Virginia Woolf is still really wonderful. She does tend to focus a lot on white characters kind of only. It's very white, British kind of, you know, depictions of things. So it's not super diverse, but I do appreciate her depictions of sexuality and gender. She is really interesting and engaging in that regard. So definitely check out Mrs. Dalloway. And that is the end of the list. I didn't realize there was exactly 10. That's kind of nice. So it's a nice 10 favorite things there. This is all I have today. This was kind of an easy, quick, fast one. But you have a wonderful week, and I will see you next Monday. Bye.